Your cucumber vines look healthy, the fruit keeps coming in, and then you bite into one, and it's bitter right at the stem end. It's not the variety, it's probably not your soil. Something else is going on, and it's easy to miss. Most gardeners across the US blame the variety first. Some cucumbers really are more bitter by nature, but plenty of sweet varieties turn bitter too. So that's not the answer. Others blame the heat wave. Heat plays a part, but it doesn't explain why one cucumber off the vine tastes clean and the next tastes awful. And some blame the beetles crawling the patch, real pest. But beetles are drawn to the same compound the plant carries anyway, bitter fruit or not. Doesn't tell you much. None of those are actually it. Here's a fast check. Think back to the last bitter cucumber you pulled. Was the soil pale, cracked, or bone dry a day or two before that? If yes, you're already circling the real answer. Here's the part almost nobody explains. Clearly, cucumbers don't get bitter randomly, and they don't get bitter because you did something careless. They get bitter because of a natural compound called cucurbitacin. And Oregon State University Extension notes it's normally concentrated in the skin and the stem end of the fruit, not spread evenly through the flesh. Una normal, comfortable growing conditions. It mostly stays right there, and the fruit tastes clean. Try this on your own cucumber right now. If you've got one on the counter, take a small bite near the stem end, then another bite from the middle. If the stem end bite's noticeably sharper than the middle, that's not in your head. That's the compound sitting exactly where it's concentrated, and it's a real-time sign the plant went through some kind of stress while that fruit was still forming. Think of it less like a mistake happening inside the plant and more like an alarm system going off exactly on schedule. Cucurbitacin's actual biological job, going back to wild cucumber relatives, is to make the plant unpleasant to chew on. So animals and insects leave it alone. It belongs to a whole family of related defense compounds found across the gourd family. So the same basic chemistry shows up in squash, melon, and pumpkins too, just tuned differently by each plant's own genetics. So when your cucumber tastes bitter, you're not tasting a flaw. You're tasting a defense response the plant is running because it perceived a threat. And the threat most often is inconsistent water. That's the twist worth sitting with for a second. The plant isn't malfunctioning when it turns bitter. It's doing exactly what evolution built it to do under stress. Just at a moment you'd rather it didn't. Cultivated cucumbers still carry those same genetics, and Utah State University Extension's research on vegetable watering specifically points to cucumbers as one of the crops most likely to develop bitter and misshapen fruit when they're drought stressed during the reproductive phase, which is the exact window when your plant is flowering and setting fruit. That timing matters. A dry stretch while your plant is just putting out its first few true leaves is far less costly than the same dry stretch once flowers and baby fruit are already on the vine, because that's the window when the plant is most sensitive and most likely to route defense compounds into the fruit itself. Part of why this mistake is so easy to fall into is your cucumber's own root system. Cucumbers don't send roots down deep the way some garden vegetables do. Most of their active root mass stays fairly close to the surface, which happens to be exactly the layer of soil that heats up fastest and dries out fastest once summer really gets going. A deep-rooted plant can ride out a dry week by reaching further down for moisture on its own. A cucumber mostly can't do that. This is also why sandy soil speeds this whole mistake up even more. Since sandy soil drains and dries out sooner than clay or loam, if your garden runs sandy, treat your watering checks as more urgent, not less. Since there's less of a buffer working in your favor, extension research also points out something that surprises a lot of gardeners. Bitterness complaints show up more often during cool growing periods than warm ones, and plant spacing and irrigation frequency both factor in alongside straightforward drought. That's worth knowing because it means the stress driving bitterness isn't only too hot, too dry, A sudden cold snap after a warm stretch can register as the same kind of shock to the plant as a dry spell does, and cucumbers crowded too close together, competing for the same limited soil moisture, tend to swing between soaked and dry faster than plants given proper room to spread. If your cucumbers are planted less than about 12 inches apart in the row, that crowding alone can be quietly working against even a decent watering routine, since each plant is pulling from a smaller, faster drying pocket of soil than it would with more space around it. A rough way to check without a tape measure: lay your hand flat, fingers spread next to the base of one plant. If the next plant starts before you can fit 2 hand widths between them, they're likely crowded enough to matter. Here's your first real action, and it takes about 10 seconds. Before your next watering, push one finger about 2 inches into the soil near the base of the plant, not right against the stem. If it still feels damp at that depth, hold off. If it feels dry, that's your plant telling you it's already behind. And bitterness risk is climbing. Do this check today before you water on autopilot, out of habit. The reason this mistake is so easy to fall into is that it doesn't look like neglect. It looks like responsibility. A lot of gardeners water on a fixed rhythm every day or every other day, regardless of what the soil is actually doing. One day, the soil's still damp from yesterday, and you add more anyway. A few days later, a hot afternoon dries that same soil out before your next scheduled watering arrives. The plant reads that swing as stress over and over, even though you were watering it the whole time. There's a second version of the same mistake, a quick daily splash that wets the top half inch and stops there. It feels even more responsible since you're out there every single day. But that light sprinkle mostly evaporates before it reaches the root zone. So the roots stay dry underneath soil that looks fine on the surface. Here's the part that trips up even attentive gardeners. Your cucumber vines wilting hard in the 2 o'clock sun isn't actually the signal you think it is. On a hot, sunny afternoon, a cucumber plant loses water through its leaves faster than its roots can pull it back in. Even when the soil underneath is perfectly moist, it droops on purpose as a way to cut its own water loss and perks back up on its own once the sun eases off. Ooh. So the exact moment most people panic and grab the hose is often the moment watering does the least good. And running out to rescue a plant that's just riding out the afternoon heat is its own quiet way of pushing the soil back toward that soaked then dry swing. The real tell isn't how the plant looks at 2 p.m. It's whether it's still drooping the next morning before the sun's even hit it. So here's the habit to stop today. Stop watering by the calendar. And stop reacting to afternoon droop. The trigger should be the soil itself, checked 2 inches down at the base of the plant, not the clock and not how tired the leaves look in the heat. Here's a small check you can run the next time you do water, and it costs you nothing extra. Set an empty tuna can or a small shallow container out near the base of the plant before you turn the hose or sprinkler on. Then check how much collects in it. If you're only getting a 1/4 inch or so before you stop watering out of habit, that's well short of what a deep watering actually requires. Even if it felt like plenty of time standing there with the hose, now let's put the full recovery plan together. Because you've already met most of these pieces, Utah State University Extension generally lands cucumbers at somewhere around 1 to 2 inches of water per week, delivered deeply rather than as frequent light sprinkles. Here's a way to picture that without doing math. After a deep watering, the soil at 2 inches down should feel like a wrung out sponge. Damp all the way through, but not soggy, not crumbly dry. In practice, that usually means watering deeply 2 to 3 times a week rather than a shallow splash every single day. So the moisture actually reaches down toward the root zone instead of evaporating off the surface. If you're using a soaker hose or drip line, aim for roughly 2 to 4 hours of runtime weekly, adjust it up during a heat wave, and down after real rainfall. Rather than running it on a fixed timer no matter what the sky is doing, Add 2 to 3 inches of organic mulch. Straw or shredded leaves work well around the base of the plant, kept a couple inches back from the stem so it doesn't stay damp and invite rot. Mulch slows evaporation from that shallow root zone, which is the layer that swings wildest without it. Water in the morning rather than the evening, at the base rather than overhead. So any water on the leaves has the day's heat to dry off before it can invite fungal trouble on top of everything else. A cheap rain gauge stake nearby helps too. Since rainfall counts toward that weekly total just as much as anything you apply by hand, a storm that already dropped an inch means you can skip the next scheduled watering entirely, which is exactly the adjustment a fixed schedule never makes. A soaker hose or drip line is the most reliable way to hit that target consistently, delivering water slowly and directly to the root zone instead of running off the surface. If you're growing in a container instead of in the ground, this whole mistake happens faster and more often, since a pot holds far less soil buffer than open garden ground and can dry out within a single hot day. Check container soil daily during peak summer heat, and expect to water potted cucumbers more frequently, sometimes daily, using the same finger test rule rather than a fixed schedule. Watering isn't the entire picture either, and it's worth naming the secondary piece so you're not chasing bitterness with water alone if something else is also quietly off. Nutrient stress can compound the same defense response. If your plants are underfed and struggling overall, that's added stress layered on top of any moisture swings. Utah State University Extension recommends side dressing cucumber plants with roughly 3 to 4 tablespoons of a nitrogen fertilizer per plant once the vines start developing. Runners sprinkled around the base and watered in, ideally before flowering starts. This isn't a replacement for fixing your watering. It's a supporting piece, since a well-fed plant handles the occasional dry stretch better than one that's already running on empty. You already have every piece of this from the last 2 sections. Assemble them, and this is what a normal week looks like. Soil checked at 2 inches before every watering, roughly 1 to 2 inches delivered deeply 2 or 3 times rather than daily. Mulch holding that moisture in between, mornings for watering. And a nitrogen side dress once runners appear. Nothing here is new, just numbered and put in order. Cucumbers that are already bitter on the vine right now generally aren't going to turn sweet, since that fruit already went through its stress window and the compound is already where it is. What you're doing is protecting the fruit that's still developing. Most growers who switch from a fixed schedule to a soil check and deep water routine start noticing sweeter fruit within the next couple of fruit set cycles, typically somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 weeks. Since that's roughly how long it takes new fruit to form and mature under steadier conditions, look for cucumbers that taste clean all the way to the stem end, not just in the middle, since the stem end is where bitterness shows up first and most reliably. If you're still getting occasional bitterness after tightening up watering, it's worth checking whether extreme heat, generally above 90 degrees Fahrenheit for extended stretches, is still stressing the plant independently. Since heat and moisture swings often show up together during the hottest weeks of summer and can take a bit longer to fully resolve than watering alone. One more thing worth knowing, since it comes from the same root cause, trellised cucumbers lose the shade their own sprawling leaves would normally cast on the soil, so that ground dries out faster than the healthy-looking vine up top would suggest. Check it a little more often than you would a plant left to sprawl. And if bitterness keeps returning no matter what you fix, it's worth knowing. Some varieties are bred with very little cucurbitacin in the first place. So genetics is a real last stop once your watering is genuinely dialed in. Keep a rough log for a few weeks. Even just a phone note each time you pick one bitter, mil, or clean, next to what the soil felt like that day. If the bitter notes cluster right after the days you skipped a check or let a hot afternoon slide by, that's your own garden confirming the mechanism. An occasional bitter cucumber, even weeks in, is normal too, not a sign. The fix-failed one, rough afternoon, can still catch a plant off guard. You're going for a clear drop and how often it happens. Not a perfect record. None of this asks you to water more overall, just to swap the trigger you're using instead of the day of the week or how tired the leaves look at 2 p.m., use what the soil at 2 inches actually feels like. So the next time you're standing over your cucumber patch, trying to decide whether to water, skip the mental calendar entirely, push your finger in the soil, feel for what's actually there, and let that decide it. Somewhere down the line, you pull another cucumber off the vine, bite in, right at that same stem end, and there's nothing there but a clean, cool crunch